Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Imagine a throne of unimaginable power. Now, imagine a prison built to protect it, not with iron bars but with gilded walls, silent servants, and the deafening echo of your own footsteps. This was the Kafes, the cage. For centuries, Ottoman princes were locked away here, their minds fraying as they waited for one of two fates, the Sultan's throne or the executioner's silken cord. This is the story of the men who went mad waiting for a crown, a tragedy of power that turned a palace into a tomb. Before the gilded cage, there was the silken cord. To understand the tragedy of the Kafes, we must first descend into the cold, pragmatic darkness from which it was born. The Ottoman Empire, a force of nature destined to dominate 3 continents, was forged in the crucible of fraternal war. Its greatest vulnerability was not a foreign army, but its own bloodline. The memory of the interregnum, the devastating decade of civil war after the defeat of Sultan Bayezid I at Ankara, was seared into the dynasty's psyche. 4 of his sons tore the empire apart, bleeding it dry in their relentless pursuit of the throne. It was a lesson the Ottomans would never forget. A divided house could not rule the world. When Sultan Mehmed II, the Fatih, the conqueror of Constantinople, ascended the throne, he was determined to cauterize this wound forever. He was a Renaissance man, a scholar, a patron of the arts, but he was also a ruler who understood the brutal calculus of power. He codified a practice that had been used intermittently into an immutable law of the state. His famous Canunime declared, with chilling clarity, "For the welfare of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the sultanate may lawfully put his brothers to death." This was not a suggestion, it was an imperial decree. It was called Nizam-ı Alem, the order of the world. The logic was as simple as it was terrifying. The life of a single prince, or even a dozen, was a small price to pay for the stability of an empire and the prevention of a civil war that could kill tens of thousands. The throne was not a birthright to be shared, but a singular peak to be held, and any rival claimant was a threat not just to the Sultan, but to the very fabric of the world order he was meant to protect. And so, the tradition began. Upon the death of a sultan, a grim race would ensue. The son who reached the capital first, secured the treasury, and won the loyalty of the Janissaries would become the new Padishah. His first act, before the mourning for his father had even truly begun, was to issue the death warrants for his own brothers. The conqueror's law was not a relic of a brutal past. It became the beating, bleeding heart of Ottoman succession for over a century. With each new sultan, a wave of terror washed over the Topkapi Palace. The most innocent of beings, infants in their cradles, boys learning to read the Quran, young men dreaming of leading armies, were transformed overnight into political threats, liabilities to be eliminated. The method of their death was prescribed by tradition. As royal blood could not be spilled, they were executed by the silken bowstring, a quiet, intimate, and horrifying end. The reign of Mehmed III, beginning in 1595, represents the apex of this savagery. Upon his father's death, Mehmed rushed to the capital. His power was not yet secure, and the law of fratricide was his shield. He gave the order. 19 of his brothers, the youngest mere infants, were led one by one before the executioners. The palace chroniclers speak of the deaf mutes, the traditional servants of the Sultan's private chambers, carrying out the grim task, their silence amplifying the horror. Imagine the scene. The grand halls of the Topkapi, adorned with intricate tiles and golden calligraphy, becoming a silent abattoir. The terrified cries of the princes, the weeping of their mothers in the harem, and then the final dreadful quiet. Afterwards, 19 small coffins were carried out of the palace gates for burial, a solemn procession that announced to the world that a new master was on the throne, his path to power paved with the bodies of his kin. This was not an isolated incident. It was the system functioning as designed. Sultan Selim the Grim, grandfather of Mehmed III, had eliminated his brothers and nephews to secure his rule. The throne of the Osmanlis, one of the most powerful on earth, was perpetually drenched in the blood of its own children. The empire was stable, its borders were expanding, but a deep psychological poison was seeping into the dynasty. The river of royal blood flowed directly from the Sultan's throne room, a constant, chilling reminder of the price of absolute power. The river of blood finally met a dam in the heart of a boy. In 1603, Sultan Mehmed III died, leaving the throne to his 13-year-old son, Ahmed I. This young teenager had been a direct witness to the horror. He had seen his father's reign begin with the slaughter of his 19 uncles. He knew the grim tradition that awaited him. The law, the court, and a century of precedent demanded that he eliminate his only surviving brother, a young boy named Mustafa. To refuse would be to invite the very chaos the law was designed to prevent. Yet Ahmed hesitated. He stood at a precipice of history, bearing a burden no child should have to carry. The fate of his brother and the future of the dynasty rested on his adolescent shoulders. Why did he break with the bloody tradition? Historians debate the reasons. Perhaps it was simple, human compassion, a revulsion at the memory of the 19 coffins. Perhaps it was the influence of the powerful women in his life, like his mother Handan Sultan, or his beloved Kosim, who may have argued for mercy. But there was also a cold, dynastic logic at play. When Ahmed took the throne, he had no children of his own. His brother Mustafa was the only other living male of the House of Osman. If Ahmed were to die in battle, or from the plague that so often stalked the capital, the entire 600-year-old dynasty would be extinguished. Killing Mustafa would secure his throne in the short term, but it would place the entire empire on a knife's edge. It was a terrible gamble. Sparing his brother meant nurturing a living, breathing rival under his own roof, a potential figurehead for any rebellion or court conspiracy. But killing him meant risking the end of everything. In a decision that shocked the empire, Ahmed chose life. He did not send the executioners for his brother. He broke the law of the conqueror. This single act of clemency, born of a mixture of fear, pragmatism, and perhaps kindness, did not solve the problem of succession. It merely transformed it. The silken cord was put away, but in its place, something new, something arguably crueler, was about to be constructed. Sultan Ahmed's mercy created a novel problem. What to do with a living, breathing, spare heir? A prince could not be allowed to walk free, to gather followers, or to become a pawn in the endless power games of the court. The solution was as ingenious as it was cruel. It was the birth of the Kafes, the cage. This was not a literal cage of iron bars, but a suite of lavishly appointed rooms, deep within the impenetrable walls of the Topkapi Palace's harem. It was a prison disguised as a paradise. Here, Ahmed's brother Mustafa, and all subsequent princes who were spared death, would live out their days. They were surrounded by opulent tapestries, fed the finest foods, and attended by servants. But they were cut off from the world. They were forbidden from learning the arts of governance or war. They were forbidden from fathering children, lest they create a rival branch of the dynasty. Their companions were deaf mutes and sequestered concubines, ensuring that no word of the outside world and no conspiracy from within could pass. Life in the cafes was a life of suspended animation. Days bled into weeks, weeks into years, and years into decades of monotonous, suffocating luxury. The princes were ghosts haunting the palace, their existence a closely guarded secret. They were a break-glass in case of emergency measure for the dynasty, human insurance policies locked away in a vault. This new system traded a swift, violent death for a slow, psychological one. Instead of the terror of the bowstring, princes now faced the creeping horror of madness born from isolation, paranoia, and utter powerlessness. They would listen for footsteps in the hall, wondering if it was a servant with their dinner or a delegation of viziers, come to either execute them or, just as terrifyingly, proclaim them Sultan. The gilded cage was forged, a monument to a new kind of Ottoman tragedy, one that would produce rulers who were broken, unstable, and utterly unprepared to inherit the world. The year is 1603. The magnificent reign of Mehmed III concludes, leaving behind a legacy of blood. He had secured his throne by executing his 19 brothers, the last great act of systematized fratricide. But his son, the young Sultan Mehmed I, would face the same grim calculus. His own brother, Mustafa, was a potential rival, a rallying point for rebellion. Tradition, law, and a century of precedent demanded the boy's death. Yet Ahmed hesitated. Was it brotherly affection? Was it the political influence of the woman who had mothered them both? Or was it a pragmatic fear? Ahmed had no sons of his own yet. If he died, the entire line of Osman, the sacred dynasty that had forged an empire, would be extinguished with him. For the first time, the silken bowstring was stayed. But salvation came at a cost. Prince Mustafa was not freed. He was merely contained. He became the first resident of a new institution, a gilded cage within the heart of Topkapi Palace known as the Kafes. Here, in opulent solitude, he was sealed away from the world. The years bled into one another. The boy grew into a man, but his mind, starved of human interaction, purpose, and sunlight, began to fray. The Kafes was not a dungeon of stone and iron, but a prison of velvet and silence, perhaps a more insidious form of torture. When Mehmed I died of typhus in 1617, the court faced an unprecedented crisis. His eldest son, Osman, was only 13. The powerful factions in the divan, wary of a child ruler, made a fateful decision. They bypassed the son and turned to the brother. They went to the Kafes and brought out a man who had not seen the world for 14 years. They placed the sword of Osman in the hands of a ghost. Sultan Mustafa I's reign was a phantom one. The man who emerged from the Kafes was not a ruler, but a relic. He wandered the palace, attempting to play with the court jesters, plucking at the turbans of his viziers, his mind lost in a fog of confusion. Power was wielded by his mother, Halim Sultan, and her allies, but their grip was tenuous. After just 96 days of chaos, he was deemed mentally unfit, a convenient truth for those who sought to control the throne. He was deposed in favor of his young nephew, Osman II, and returned to the silent solitude of his cage. The Kafes had become a revolving door, but Mustafa's story was not over. Osman II, young and ambitious, attempted to reform the very institution that had put him on the throne, the Janissary Corps. It was a fatal miscalculation. In 1622, the Janissaries rose in a bloody revolt, capturing the young sultan and subjecting him to humiliation and a brutal execution. The empire was headless, the capital in flames. The rebels, having murdered their master, needed a new one, preferably one who would not challenge them. Once again, they turned to the Kafes. They broke down the door to Mustafa's chamber. The prince, now utterly terrified, cowered in a corner, believing they were Osman's executioners. He had been imprisoned, released, and imprisoned again. His psyche could not withstand another turn of the wheel. They had to drag him, weeping and screaming, to the throne room. His second reign was a macabre spectacle. He was a puppet whose strings were pulled by warring factions. He was seen throwing gold coins into the Bosphorus for the fish to eat, a sovereign lost in his own shattered mind. The state withered. Finally, the court could bear it no longer. He was deposed once more, replaced by another nephew, the formidable Murad IV. This time, there would be no return to the Kafes. Mustafa was quietly strangled in his rooms, a tragic footnote, the first and most broken victim of the cage built to save him. With the rise of Murad IV, The atmosphere within the Kafes curdled from one of lonely stagnation to one of visceral terror. Murad had witnessed the chaos of his uncle's reigns and the violent deposition of his brother, Osman. He ascended the throne as a boy, but grew into a man of iron and blood. He restored order to the crumbling empire with breathtaking brutality, earning the name Murad the Cruel. He was a throwback to the warrior sultans of old, and he had little patience for the new system of containment. To him, the Kafes was not a humane alternative to fratricide. It was merely a holding cell for future threats. His surviving brothers, Bayezid, Suleiman, and Qasim, lived under his constant menacing shadow. They had grown up in confinement, but now their gilded cage felt like death row. Every rustle of silks in the hallway, every heavy footstep outside their door could signal the arrival of the mute executioners. Murad, consumed by a need for absolute control, saw conspiracy in every corner. In 1635, returning from his victorious campaign in Yerevan, he gave the order. His brothers Bayezid and Suleiman were executed. The Kafes had failed its primary purpose. It had not ended fratricide. It had only delayed it, transforming it from a swift, grim necessity at the start of a reign to a drawn-out psychological torture that could end at the Sultan's slightest whim. The remaining princes, Qasim and Ibrahim, were paralyzed by fear. Qasim made a fatal error. He was seen as popular, perhaps too much so. During a moment of celebration, Murad perceived a hint of pride in his brother's demeanor. It was enough. The bowstring was called for again. Now, only one brother remained. One prince, locked away, listening to the screams of his siblings echo in his memory, waiting for the day his own door would be opened for the last time. For 22 years, Prince Ibrahim had breathed the stale air of the Kafes. He was a child when he was first confined, and now he was a man of 25, yet his entire conscious life had been spent within those silent, lavishly decorated walls. He was not merely imprisoned, he was marinated in terror. He had watched as, one by one, his powerful brothers were led away to their deaths on the orders of Murad the Cruel. Ibrahim, the youngest and deemed the least threatening, was the sole survivor. He lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing suspense, convinced that every day would be his last. His sanity hung by a thread, woven from paranoia and dread. In 1640, the fearsome Sultan Murad IV lay on his deathbed, his body ravaged by cirrhosis. As he breathed his last, the Grand Vizier, Kemankesh Kara Mustafa Pasha, rushed to the Kafes to deliver the news. The empire needed a sultan. Ibrahim was the only one left. But when the vizier arrived and announced that Murad was dead and Ibrahim was now the padishah, the prince recoiled in horror. He barricaded the door, screaming that it was a trick. He was certain that this was Murad's final, cruel command, to lure him out with false hope before the executioners could seize him. His pleas were desperate, his terror absolute. The Grand Vizier was at a loss. The Ottoman Empire was without a ruler because the heir was too frightened to accept the crown. In a moment of grim necessity, he ordered the body of the dead sultan to be brought and displayed before the door of the Kafes. Only when Ibrahim saw the corpse of his fearsome brother with his own eyes did he dare to unbolt the door. He emerged, blinking into the light, a man-child broken by 2 decades of silence and fear. The psychological damage was profound and irreparable. The Kafes had successfully preserved his life, but in doing so, it had created a monarch wholly unprepared for the burdens of an empire, setting the stage for one of the most calamitous reigns in Ottoman history. When the high officials of the court came for Ibrahim in 1640, he barricaded himself inside his chambers. For 22 years, the Kafes had been his world, a gilded prison where the only news from outside was often the silent procession carrying the silk bowstring for one of his brothers. He was certain they had come for him. It took the powerful persuasion of his mother, the Valid Kösem Sultan, and the presentation of his predecessor Murad IV's corpse to convince him that he was not being led to his execution, but to the throne of the world. This horrifying coronation set the stage for one of the most bizarre and destructive reigns in Ottoman history. The prince who emerged from the cage was not a ruler. He was a deeply broken man, his mind a labyrinth of paranoia and obsession forged in 2 decades of isolation and terror. Initially, Kosem Sultan ruled through him, but Ibrahim's damaged psyche could not be contained. He developed strange and costly compulsions. He was obsessed with ambergris, sending agents across the world to procure it. He developed a fetish for obese women, dispatching officials to find the heaviest concubines for his harem, lavishing them with jewels and titles. His court devolved into a theater of the absurd, governed by whimsy and fear. Viziers were appointed and executed based on momentary impulses. His paranoia grew, culminating in an act of unspeakable cruelty. Believing a member of his harem had been unfaithful, he allegedly ordered all 280 of his concubines to be bound in sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. The Kafes had successfully prevented a war of succession, but in doing so it had placed a madman, a psychological casualty of the system, upon the sacred throne of Osman. By 1648, the patience of the Ottoman state had worn thin. Ibrahim's madness was no longer a palace eccentricity. It was a mortal threat to the empire. His lavish spending had emptied the treasury, and his erratic commands had crippled the administration. The final straw was his arbitrary execution of respected officials and a new, crushing tax to fund his whims. The Janissaries, the ulama, and even his own mother, Kosem Sultan, conspired against him. In a swift coup, the palace guards seized the Sultan. He was not killed, not yet. Instead, he suffered the ultimate humiliation. He was dragged back to the Kafes, the very prison that had shattered his mind. The cycle had come full circle. His 7-year-old son, Mehmed IV, was hailed as the new Sultan. But a child on the throne created a power vacuum, igniting a fierce struggle between the boy's mother, Turhan Sultan, and his grandmother, the formidable Kosem. This was the apex of the Sultanate of women. Meanwhile, Ibrahim, imprisoned once more, remained a dangerous symbol. His supporters could rally to his cause. The new regime, fragile and fearful, made a grim decision. A fatwa was issued, sanctioning the execution of the deposed Sultan. Executioners entered the Kafes. Ibrahim's final pleas for his life echoed through the cold stone halls before the silk cord silenced him forever. His death marked a profound turning point. A sultan had been deposed and executed by his own ministers and soldiers. The sacred, untouchable authority of the Padishah was broken. For the next several decades, power would not reside with the sultan, but with powerful viziers, particularly from the Köprülü family, who ran the empire while the monarch was a mere figurehead. The Kafes had not only destroyed a man, it had critically weakened the institution it was meant to protect. While the empire convulsed under child sultans and powerful viziers, other princes languished, forgotten in the Kafes. None waited longer than Suleiman, another son of the mad Sultan Ibrahim. He was just 6 years old when his father was executed and he was locked away. His confinement would last for 39 years. Imagine a lifetime spent in a handful of rooms, watching the world through a latticed screen. He saw his brother, Mehmed IV, grow from a boy into a man, lead hunts, and wage wars. He heard of the empire's triumphs under the Köprülü viziers and its devastating failure at the Siege of Vienna in 1683. Seasons turned into years, years into decades. The world outside was a muffled echo, a story told by servants and eunuchs. Unlike his father, whose mind had fractured into violent paranoia, Suleiman's spirit turned inward. Faced with the constant, looming threat of execution, he became deeply, profoundly religious. He embraced a stoic fatalism, dedicating his days to prayer, study, and calligraphy. He resigned his fate to God, finding solace in devotion rather than despair. Then, in 1687, the echo from the outside world became a roar. The disastrous Great Turkish War led to the deposition of his brother, Mehmed IV. The palace officials came for the 45-year-old prince. After nearly 4 decades of silence, the doors to the Kafes swung open. Suleiman did not see liberation. He saw the end. Convinced his turn for the bowstring had finally come, he told the delegation, "If my death has been commanded, say so. From my childhood, I have known nothing but suffering." He had to be coaxed out, assured that he was being led not to the executioner's block, but to the throne. The man who emerged was pious, gentle, and utterly broken, a ghost summoned to rule an empire on the brink of collapse. His life had been spared, but his soul had been imprisoned long ago. Suleiman II's reign was a testament to the Kafes' psychological toll. He was intelligent and pious, but his decades of isolation had rendered him incapable of decisive leadership. He was a stranger in his own palace, unfamiliar with the mechanisms of state. His most significant act was recognizing his own inadequacy and appointing a brilliant Grand Vizier, Köprülü Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, to manage the crumbling empire. While the vizier fought desperately to turn the tide of the war, Suleiman remained a spectral figure, more concerned with religious observance than military strategy. After a brief 4-year reign, he succumbed to illness, a man worn down by a lifetime of waiting. The throne then passed to his brother, Ahmed II. If Suleiman's story was tragic, Ahmed's was the system's horrifying apotheosis. He had been imprisoned for 43 years, since the age of 3. When the court officials came to announce his accession, his first words were not of ambition or gratitude, but of pure, distilled terror. "Is it my turn to die?" he asked, recoiling from them. For him, being summoned from the Kafes was not an elevation. It was a death sentence, the fate he had seen befall his father and expected for himself for over 4 decades. His reign was short, lasting less than 4 years, and marked by catastrophe. His brilliant Grand Vizier was killed in battle, a loss from which the empire, and the Sultan himself, never recovered. Ahmed, already frail and melancholic, sank into a deep depression, his health failing rapidly. The brothers, Suleiman II and Ahmed II, represent the ultimate paradox of the Kafes. The system, designed to prevent fratricidal bloodshed, had succeeded, but it had replaced the sword with a slower, more insidious poison. It produced sultans who were not tyrants, but men so psychologically crushed, so detached from reality, that they were mere phantoms on the throne, presiding over an empire they no longer knew how to lead. For 43 years, the world of Shehzade Ahmed was one of ink, parchment, and prayer. Within the gilded silence of the Kafes, he was not a prince waiting for a throne, but a scholar seeking refuge in the divine order of calligraphy and the profound verses of the Quran. He translated learned texts, composed poetry, and found a fragile peace in a life of quiet contemplation. The bloody machinations of the court, the thunder of Janissary revolts, the distant cries of battlefield victories and defeats, all were muted sounds from another reality. His was a world measured not in political alliances, but in the elegant curve of a well-formed Arabic letter. But in 1691, that reality shattered. His brother, Suleiman II, another ghost from the Kafes, died, and at the age of 48, the scholar was dragged from his sanctuary and thrust onto the throne as Sultan Ahmed II. The empire he inherited was not a subject for serene contemplation. It was a behemoth bleeding from a dozen wounds. The Great Turkish War raged on, and the Holy League was relentlessly pushing back the Ottoman frontiers. The man who had spent his life mastering the pen was now handed a sword he did not know how to wield. The transition was a personal cataclysm. His profound piety was offended by the corruption he saw, his gentle nature shattered by the brutality required of a wartime leader. He appointed able viziers, hoping their experience could compensate for his own, but the disasters mounted. The devastating defeat at the Battle of Slankamen saw the death of his Grand Vizier and thousands of his best soldiers. News of the loss reportedly plunged Ahmed into such deep grief and despair that his own health began to fail. He was a man of conscience in a profession that had none, a man of peace forced to be a symbol of war. His short 4-year reign was a testament to the cruelty of the Kafes system. It had not prepared a ruler. It had merely preserved a life, only to sacrifice it to circumstances for which it was utterly, tragically unsuited. Ahmed II was the scholar in chains, a man whose spirit was broken not by his long imprisonment, but by his sudden, brutal liberation. When Ahmed III ascended the throne in 1703, he too was a graduate of the Kafes. He had spent years in its suffocating confines, watching his brother Mustafa II rule, knowing his own life hung by the thread of his siblings' whim. Yet the reign that unfolded under his watch was unlike any that had come before. It was an explosion of color, poetry, and light, a period so decadent and aesthetically obsessed that it would be known forever as the Lail Devri, the Tulip Age. How could an era of such deliberate, almost frantic beauty emerge from the grim shadow of the cage? Perhaps the answer lies not in spite of the Kafes, but because of it. The Tulip Age was not a simple period of peace and prosperity. It was a form of collective therapy, a grand, empire-wide attempt to escape the recent past. For decades, the throne had been occupied by traumatized men who had spent their lives in confinement. The court had been a place of paranoia, austerity, and the ever-present threat of violence. Ahmed III, guided by his visionary Grand Vizier, Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, seemed determined to build a new world. Palaces and waterfront mansions, or yalis, were built along the Bosphorus. Elaborate moonlit festivals were held in gardens overflowing with thousands of rare, priceless tulips. Poets sang of love and wine, not conquest. For the first time, an Ottoman embassy was sent to Paris, not to negotiate a treaty, but to observe and import the culture of the West. It was a fragile, beautiful dream. But the Kafes was more than a building. It was a psychological state embedded in the dynasty's DNA. While the elite celebrated in their gardens, the common people faced economic hardship and felt alienated by this new, foreign-influenced culture. The opulence of the Tulip Age was a mask, hiding the deep scars of the previous century. It was a desperate flight from the gray reality of the cage into a fantasy of vibrant color. And like any fever dream, it was destined to have a violent, sudden awakening, proving that no amount of tulips could ever truly fill the void left by decades of fear and isolation. Within the silent corridors of the Kafes, one prince was easier to underestimate than all the others. Shehzade Mahmud was not just a prisoner. He was marked by a physical deformity, a kyphosis that stooped his back and made him an object of pity or contempt in a court that prized physical perfection. For 27 years, while his uncle Ahmed III presided over the dazzling Tulip Age, Mahmud waited in the shadows. He was the forgotten prince, the hunchback who, by all accounts, should have been a footnote in history, easily disposed of when the time came. But those who dismissed him failed to see the mind being forged in that crucible of isolation and scorn. Mahmud learned to be observant, patient, and deeply cunning. He understood that to be noticed was to be endangered. He survived not by projecting strength, but by feigning weakness, by making himself seem a non-threat. Then, in 1730, the dream of the Tulip Age ended in fire and revolt. The Patrona Halil rebellion tore through the capital, deposing Ahmed III and demanding a new sultan. The choice fell to the one they had all overlooked. Mahmud I was brought forth from the Kafes and placed on the throne. The court expected a broken, pliable ruler. They were profoundly mistaken. Mahmud proved to be one of the most capable sultans of the 18th century. He decisively crushed the very rebellion that had elevated him, restoring order with a swift and ruthless hand. He navigated complex geopolitical currents, waging successful wars against both Austria and Persia, regaining territory that had been lost for decades. He was a great patron of architecture, and Istanbul still bears the mark of his constructions, including the beautiful Nur Osmaniye Mosque. His reign was a stunning refutation of every assumption made about him. He had turned the anonymity of the Kafes into a shield and his physical affliction into a source of inner strength. Mehmed I was the ultimate survivor, a man whose twisted spine concealed a will of iron, proving that the true measure of a monarch was not his posture, but his resilience. If the Kafes was a science, a cruel experiment in human endurance, then Osman III was its final, most tragic result. No man in the history of the Ottoman dynasty endured the cage longer. For 51 years, more than half a century, he lived in gilded imprisonment. He was a boy of 5 when he was first locked away. He watched his father, Mustafa II, be deposed. He watched his uncle, Ahmed III, preside over the tulip age. He watched his older brother, Mehmed I, rule for 24 successful years. All the while, Osman waited, his world shrinking to a few ornate rooms, his human contact limited to deaf-mute servants and the ever-present guards. When he finally ascended the throne in 1754 at the age of 55, he was not a ruler. He was a psychological ruin. The man who emerged from the Kafes was a specter, haunted by a lifetime of silence, paranoia, and sensory deprivation. His reign was short, lasting only 3 years, and it is remembered not for policies or wars, but for his profound eccentricities. He harbored a deep, inexplicable hatred for music, banning it entirely from the palace. The vibrant sounds of the court were replaced by the same oppressive silence he had known his entire life. He also displayed a severe intolerance for female company, so much so that he took to wearing iron-nailed shoes. The loud, clacking sound would announce his approach, giving any women in the palace corridors time to flee and hide. He did not want to see them, nor be seen by them. His reign was a projection of his trauma. The isolation he had been forced to endure became the isolation he imposed on others. He was the ghost in his own palace, a man who had waited a lifetime for a crown he no longer had the capacity to wear. Osman III represents the ultimate cost of the Kafes. The system had successfully prevented a war of succession and preserved his life, but it had methodically, year by year, dismantled his soul. He was the Sultan who survived everything except his own survival. In 1730, as the Tulip era's extravagant parties burned to ashes in the Patrona Halil rebellion, a new sultan was summoned from the depths of the Topkapi Palace. His name was Mehmed I. For 27 years he had lived in the Kafes, a silent world of marble and dread, imprisoned by his uncle, Ahmed III. When the palace guards came for him, he was convinced they carried the silk bowstring of the executioner. He wept and begged for his life, a grown man reduced to a terrified child. Instead, he was led not to his death, but to the throne of the Ottoman Empire. The terror of that moment, however, would never leave him. It would curdle into a deep, unshakable paranoia that would define his 24-year reign. Mehmed I emerged from his gilded cage not as a leader, but as a warden. He had spent his youth in forced quietude, and he would now impose that silence upon his capital. He saw conspiracy lurking in every shadow, sedition in every public gathering. His first targets were the coffee houses and taverns of Istanbul, vibrant hubs of social life, poetry, and debate. To Mahmud, they were nests of rebellion, the very places where the plot that overthrew his uncle had been hatched. He banned them, sending his guards to smash the offending establishments. But his crusade against public joy went further. He developed a profound aversion to music. The sound of instruments, the melodies that had filled the gardens during his uncle's reign, now seemed to him like the soundtrack to decadence and disorder. He forbade music in public spaces, associating it with the frivolity that he believed led to moral and political rot. The man who had been denied the sounds of the world for nearly 3 decades now sought to mute the world itself. It was a tragic irony. The prisoner, once freed, sought to recreate the silence of his own cell, projecting the barren landscape of his own traumatized mind onto the entire empire. If Mehmed I was a testament to the psychological damage of the Kafes, his successors were evidence of its systemic failure. The institution, created to prevent the fratricidal bloodshed of the past, was now producing a dynasty of broken men. The empire was no longer ruled by warrior poets raised on the battlefield and in provincial capitals, but by pale shadows who had spent their entire lives as prisoners. Consider Ottoman III, who succeeded his brother Mahmud in 1754. By the time he ascended the throne, he was 55 years old and had spent over half a century in the Kafes, the longest confinement of any future sultan. The world he was now meant to rule was a complete abstraction to him. His mind, starved of stimulation and warped by fear, had retreated into a labyrinth of bizarre eccentricities. He harbored an intense, pathological hatred for the presence of women. So great was his aversion that he took to wearing iron-soled shoes, their loud clanking on the marble floors heralding his approach and giving the women of the harem time to flee and hide. He, like his brother, also detested music, banishing all musicians from the palace and reportedly having their instruments destroyed. His 3-year reign was inconsequential from a political or military perspective, but it was a glaring symptom of the deep sickness within the Ottoman system of succession. Power was no longer wielded by the Sultan. It had bled into the hands of the Grand Viziers, the palace eunuchs, and the Valid Sultan. They were the ones who truly governed, managing the empire while the man on the throne was busy ensuring his hallways were empty and silent. The Kafes had succeeded in stopping princes from killing each other for the throne, but it was now killing their spirit, their competence, and their sanity, long before they ever had a chance to rule. The system wasn't just cracking, it was crumbling from the head down. For every prince who emerged from the Kafes, blinking in the unfamiliar sun, there were countless others who never left. They were the forgotten sons, the spare heirs, the silent specters who lived and died within the Shimshirlik, the so-called Boxwood Garden. Their stories are not of reigns and decrees, but of a quiet, unending tragedy played out in gilded isolation. Life inside was a paradox of luxury and deprivation. The princes were served the finest foods on porcelain and silver, attended by servants and concubines, but they were starved of purpose, freedom, and human connection beyond their cloistered world. Their days were a monotonous cycle of prayer, study, and waiting. They waited for the death of the reigning sultan, a moment that could mean one of two things: their ascension to the throne, or their own state-sanctioned murder by the new ruler. Every footstep in the corridor, every unexpected knock, could signal the arrival of the executioner. This constant, gnawing fear was a form of psychological torture from which there was no escape. Some princes retreated into piety, finding solace in the Quran. Others descended into madness, their minds shattering against the marble walls of their prison. There are whispers of princes who spent their days talking to imaginary companions, who developed debilitating phobias, or who fell into a catatonic state of despair. They were men with the most prestigious bloodline in the empire, yet they possessed less freedom than the humblest farmer. They could see the minarets of Istanbul over the palace walls, but could never visit them. They could hear the bustle of the city, but could never join it. The Kafes was a tomb for the living, a place where ambition went to die. The echoes of their unlived lives, their silent screams and whispered prayers became a permanent part of the palace's atmosphere, a haunting reminder of the devastating human cost of dynastic survival. The Kafes was the Ottoman Empire's elegant, tragic, and ultimately self-defeating solution to a bloody problem. In cauterizing the wound of princely civil war, it introduced a slow-acting poison into the imperial bloodstream. For over 2 centuries, this prison of gold systematically dismantled the very qualities that had forged the empire in the first place. The early sultans, Mehmed the Conqueror, Selim the Grim, Suleiman the Magnificent, were products of a ruthless but effective training ground. Sent to govern provinces as youths, they learned statecraft, led armies, and understood the vast and varied lands they were destined to rule. They were forged in the crucible of real-world responsibility and conflict. The Kafes replaced this crucible with a velvet-lined coffin. It severed the vital connection between the ruler and the realm. The princes no longer understood the military, the economy, or the complex geopolitics of their time. They emerged onto the world stage as amateurs, decades behind their European counterparts who were centralizing power and modernizing their states. This crisis of leadership could not have come at a worse time. As Europe surged forward with the Enlightenment, industrialization, and military innovation, the Ottoman Empire was often led by men whose primary life experience was one of paranoid confinement. While grand viziers and powerful pashas tried to steer the ship of state, the ultimate authority rested with a sultan who might be mentally unstable, hopelessly naive, or simply too terrified to make a decisive move. The legacy of the Kafes is a legacy of ruin. It created a chain of ineffective rulers that accelerated the empire's stagnation. It traded the short-term chaos of fratricide for the long-term decay of incompetence. The golden cage did not just imprison princes. It shackled the dynasty itself, ensuring that when the Ottoman state faced its greatest challenges, the man on the throne was often the least equipped person in the empire to save it.